The biggest threat to American soldiers may blow your mind: our own weapons. I'll explain. Because all the way back in 2011, a team from DARPA, or the Pentagon's research agency, they decided to run an experiment. And they put all these little sensors the size of a quarter on 10,000 soldiers in Afghanistan. And they were looking to measure the blast exposure from roadside bombs. Because naturally to them, they're like, yeah, the IEDs planted by insurgents, that's the #1 threat to US troops. Let's get the data. But when the data actually started rolling in, a whole different picture emerged. They found that 75% of the soldiers' blast exposure actually came from their own weapons. Things like grenades, rocket launchers, tanks, and artillery that deliver an enormous percussive boom. And so with this, you have David Burkholder, the lead researcher on the study, telling the New York Times, it was hugely surprising. The danger was us. We were doing it ourselves. But then in 2016, the military just shelves the program, saying this data, it's inconsistent, it's unreliable. Except Burkholder, he thinks that it just gave Army leadership something they didn't want to hear. Namely, that the military's most beloved heavy weapons, they're not just destroying their intended targets, but they're also destroying the minds of the people using them. With, for example, one DoD expert on the subject explaining, if the right kind of wave hits brain tissue, the tissue just breaks. It literally gets torn apart. We see that in the lab. And while the research suggests that soldiers appear to recover at a few days or a few weeks after a blast, right, similar to a concussion, like a concussion, that's incredibly bad. Because when they are subjected to these shockwaves over and over again, hundreds or even thousands of times throughout their deployment, the damage can become permanent. I mean, think about it like in the NFL, you have players retiring with insane amounts of brain trauma from repeatedly bashing their heads together. And so with data taken from soldiers firing shoulder-mounted rocket launchers over 3 years, not a shock, it showed that they had worse memories and reaction times, worse coordination, lower cognitive and executive function, and elevated levels of proteins in their blood that are markers of brain injury. But still, to this day, we don't have a reliable test for the mental trauma caused by blast exposure, which is also why it's often called an invisible injury. And it's also why symptoms are frequently misdiagnosed. They think it's simple PTSD or other psychiatric disorders. But in the last decade, veterans suffering from traumatic brain injuries, which there are at least 400,000 of them just since 2000, and that's probably an underestimate, they pressured Congress to study the effects of blast exposure from their own weapons. And in 2016, the Defense Department actually found a perfect natural experiment, because the US wanted to destroy the Islamic State in Syria, but they also wanted to minimize the number of boots on the ground. And so to do that, they relied heavily on airstrikes and artillery operated by just a handful of troops bombarding the enemy from miles away. But because of this strategy, those soldiers fired far more shells per person than any artillery crew since at least the Vietnam War. We're talking into the tens of thousands. And so the Marine Corps conducted a study on one of the hardest hit batteries published in 2019. And it found that more than half of the crew members, they eventually received diagnoses of traumatic brain injuries, with it warning that firing tons of rounds day after day, it could incapacitate crews faster than new crews could be trained to replace them. Yet the DoD did little to protect its soldiers. And actually, when they reported these issues, it didn't always take them seriously. I mean, just take the example of Christian Bayer. Christian worked with the M1 Abrams tanks for 23 years, eventually rising to the rank of Master Sergeant, was in charge of training young tank crews. But in 2020, when he was 38, as old as I am right now, he began to fall apart. His family telling the Times he couldn't sleep, he lost his balance, he slurred his words, he wept about small things and became paranoid about imagined conspiracies. There was one night he allegedly shoved his wife during an argument, he grabbed for a kitchen knife when a senior sergeant tried to calm him down. By this point, his wife said that she'd begun worrying that Christian had been exposed to too many tank blasts, and saying she told his command that he needed a thorough medical evaluation. But then, instead of sending him to one of the military's specialized brain injury centers, the DoD just court-martialed him for pushing his wife and other crimes. They jailed him, they reduced his rank, they forced him to retire last spring. And so then, with all his paranoia, Christian left his wife and kids and ends up wandering aimlessly around the country, leading to then other things like this dispute between him and 2 other men over parking in October. There he allegedly pulled a knife, then tried to run them over and fled. Multi-day manhunt eventually tracking him down. They arrest him on state and federal charges, though he pleads not guilty. But also, his case is just one of dozens that were investigated by the Times last year. And understand, by no means was that the most extreme, with reporter Dave Phillips finding soldiers who came back from deployment suffering from depression, panic attacks, even visual and auditory hallucinations. And time after time, they were misunderstood or brushed off, with so many of them just ending up homeless in a psych ward or dead from taking their own lives, or in a few cases, taking other people's lives. Do you remember back in October of last year, there was that gunman who opened fire at a bowling alley in a bar in Lewiston, Maine? He killed 18 people. That included children. And at that time, it was reported that he had been hearing voices and was actually involuntarily committed during the summer. But what we didn't know back then is he actually had worked for years as an instructor at an Army hand grenade training range, with the soldiers from his unit saying he could have easily been exposed to more than 10,000 blasts. Now, I do want to say, with him as well as the other cases that we've talked about, it's impossible right now to know for sure that their mental issues were caused by the blasts. But it would sure be a coincidence that the Lewiston shooter began wearing hearing aids around the time that he started hallucinating. And again, we're talking about at just 39 years old. So recently, the state's medical examiner sent part of his brain to a lab to analyze it for maladies caused by repeated head trauma. And so now, thanks to these incidents and the Times reporting, the Pentagon has begun taking the issue more seriously, with it setting a limit above which weapon blasts are considered hazardous in 2022. Though a big caveat there, that limit was actually calculated using decades-old research on damage to soldiers' hearing, not their brains. Plus, it just simply measures a shockwave's peak pressure, putting the limit at 4 pounds per square inch. But blast exposure is much more complicated. Where some waves reach a high peak, but they pass quickly, while others with maybe like a lower peak, they may just last longer and deliver more energy. But that's also just one thing the DoD is doing. It's like a bunch more steps in December. Things like reaching out to thousands of veterans, notifying veteran services offices about the potential injuries, and creating a website showing how to recognize traumatic brain injuries. But still, in the meantime, it appears that very little has actually changed on the ground for actual soldiers, right? Soldiers who are still using all the same weapons. Because to that point, you can't just have a military with no weapons, but there does have to be a better way, unless we're just fine with this being one of the costs of war. Though the answer to that question is probably a scary one, because based off of how our government treats veterans now, it appears that that is the case. You're a hero when they need you, and you're a zero when you're done. The government's like the worst friend we've all had. But with all that said, I love your opinions on this situation and those comments down below.